Hey guys, it's Yuta and welcome to my room. And let's learn more Japanese with my reaction video to Akidearest.
私は3ヶ月間横浜デザイン学院に入学しました。毎日9時から12時半まで勉強しました。
So my version of her first sentence is 私は3ヶ月間横浜デザイン学院で勉強しました Because 入学 just means to enter school, but what she meant was she was studying in the school. And I got this comment saying that that's not exactly what she wrote in her subtitles. But the reason why I used a different word is like each language has its own way of expressing the same ideas. So literal translations don't always work. In her subtitles, she used the word to attend, and that would be 出席する in Japanese. But we simply don't say 横浜デザイン学院に出席しました to express the same idea. So literal translation doesn't always work. Alternatively, you can actually say 私は3ヶ月間横浜デザイン学院に行きました and that works fine. And I also connected all of the sentences and said 3ヶ月間横浜デザイン学院で勉強したんですけど、毎日9時から20時半まで勉強して、すごい大変だったんですけど、すごい勉強になりました。But of course, that's not the only way of rewriting her sentences. You can come up with different ways. So I'm going to give you another version, which is 3ヶ月間横浜デザイン学院に行って、毎日9時から20時半まで勉強して、すごい大変だったけど、すごい勉強になりましたね。So here I use the te form 行って、勉強して。Using the te form like this is a very common way of describing a series of actions. So 行って、勉強して、things like that. I also added ね which is a very common sentence ending particle that we use in a conversation like this. So it makes very conversational. And ね here sounds like you're processing your own opinions and emotions internally. You can also say すごい勉強になりましたよ. And we use yo when we want to actively share some information with other people. So if you use yo, it sounds more like, hey, listen, it was really educational.So different nuances.
学校に行く前はたくさん日本語が分かりましたが、あまり話せませんでした。
So I said that this sentence was a bit confusing because it sounds like she was comparing what she was like before going to school and after going to school. So it sounded like, oh, before I went to school, I could understand Japanese, but after going to school. And it was kind of weird because if you say but, you would think that she would say something like, oh, after going to school, I couldn't understand Japanese anymore, which doesn't make sense. So I rewrote these sentences and said, 学校に行く前は日本語は分かりましたが、あまり話せませんでした。And the difference is what if you add what here, it sounds like you're comparing your comprehension skills and speaking skills.But I think this sentence is still a bit confusing because if you use the word わかる to understand in Japanese, it actually sounds like you can also speak Japanese. If you say 日本語わかります, it sounds like you not only can you understand Japanese, you can also speak Japanese. So you have to use a different word and you can actually use 理解するwhich also can be translated as to understand, but the difference is if you say 理解する, the emphasis on more like your intellectual capability of understanding. So in this context, this is a better word. I would also use the word 喋る instead of 話す. If you listen to us, we actually usually say 日本語喋れる I can speak Japanese instead of 日本語話せる 喋る is more like casually speaking than 話す If you say 話す it sounds like you talk about something that has a substantial content. So if you want to say something like, oh, let's talk about this, you'd use 話す But if you focus on the act of speaking, you'd use 喋る So that's why we say 日本語喋れる So this sentence becomes 学校に行く前は日本語は理解できましたがあまり喋れませんでした And if you want to emphasize your listening comprehension skills, you can also say 学校に行く前は日本語は聞き取れましたがあまり喋れませんでした。So 聞き取れる to be able to hear what people are saying. So I got this comment asking if you can drop は and say 学校に行く前日本語は理解できましたがあまり喋れませんでした。And yes, you can. But this comment got a reply that gives you this sentence. 学校に行く前、日本語分かったけど、あんまり話さなかった。But this is not correct for what she wants to say, because if you say あんまり話さなかった、it sounds like you didn't want to speak. But that's not what she meant. She meant she couldn't speak because of her lack of speaking skills. So you should be very, very careful with random comments like this because it's very hard to tell if it's a good comment or bad comment unless you already speak Japanese fluently. And I got another question about if you can say 学校に行く前に instead of 学校に行く前は No, you can't. And this time the reply is actually good. So there are good comments, but again, it's very difficult to tell unless you are already at the native level.
しまじろうは子供のアニメです。そしてアニメの日本語は簡単です。
And here's my version. しまじろうは子供のアニメで日本語が簡単です。I used で to connect the sentences, and I also used が instead of は. Now this is the tricky part, so listen to me carefully. So this was originally two sentences, right? The first sentence is しまじろうは子供のアニメです。And the second sentence is しまじろうは日本語が簡単です。As for しまじろう, the Japanese that's used is easy. Now, we use what to introduce a topic or highlight information. And here we are introducing a topic. And when we use wa, the scope of the topic goes beyond just one sentence. So as long as you are talking about Shimajiro, you don't have to say Shimajiro wa in every sentence. But what happens if you change ga to wa and say Shimajiro wa nihongo wa kantan desu? Now we are using wa to highlight nihongo. It's like emphasizing because we want to say something about it. So it sounds like there's but, demo, coming. So if you say something like 島次郎は日本語は簡単です。でも内容は面白くないです。As for 島次郎, the Japanese is easy, but the content is not interesting. We used wa here because we are comparing the Japanese that's used in the anime and the content. So that's why ga is the most neutral particle you can use here. But you know what's interesting? This sentence, 島次郎は日本語が簡単です。It's actually pretty hard to grammatically explain this sentence. There's a famous phrase among Japanese linguists, and that's 象は鼻が長い. The elephant's nose is long. And it has the same structure as 島次郎は日本語が簡単. And different people had different explanations of this sentence because they were thinking like, oh, what's the subject of this sentence? It's not the elephant. And if hana, the nose, is the subject, what is zo? Isn't zo also kind of a subject? So people have different theories about this. And then there was a guy who came up with a completely new explanation. And he published a book called 象は鼻が長い in 1960. And his explanation is, well, Japanese sentences don't have subjects. 象 is actually just a topic. Hana is just some extra supplementary information to nagai. Things like that. And if you read something about Japanese grammar, you've probably come across this concept that what is a topic marker? Well, it's actually based on his theory. And there was a comment that said, oh, terms like topic marker are confusing. And the reason why they use the word topic is because they don't want to use the word subject. Because if you use the word subject, you're kind of thinking from the perspective of European languages. So every sentence has a subject, and each sentence has only one subject. Things like that. But Japanese is very different from European languages, so you can't really explain Japanese using frameworks of European languages. And if this topic is too difficult for you, I will teach you the kind of Japanese real-life Japanese people today actually speak, and I will teach you from zero. So click the link in the description and subscribe to my email group. Now, going back to the comment, it actually had a reply, but their explanation, I wouldn't say it's 100% wrong, but it's quite misleading. When you use wa, yes, it's possible to interpret that it's talking about Japanese in general, as in the Japanese language is easy. But from the context, this is a very unlikely way of interpreting the sentence. So you shouldn't trust random comments like this when you read it, because you can't really tell if that person knows what they're talking about. There are some good comments and there are some bad comments, but it's very hard to tell. There's another comment that said she pronounced des as desu instead of des.
今の日本語の一番のチャレンジは、でとえにがとです。
But this doesn't make any clear semantic differences. Whether you say des or desu, the chances are we probably wouldn't even notice. If you want to fine-tune your Japanese pronunciation, maybe you can think about this. But things like pitch accent is much more important because it does make huge semantic differences. So if you're learning Japanese, it's more efficient to pay attention to things that actually matter, which I will teach you if you subscribe to my email group, because I will teach you the kind of Japanese the real-life Japanese people today actually speak, because textbooks and apps can be unnatural and outdated. So click the link and subscribe to my email group, Japanese with Yuta.